want to thank the presidential libraries. All of them are one marvelous source of historical research. I've had the pleasure of working here at the Hoover Library as well as the Truman Library and the Roosevelt Library, and I think it's been a wonderful experience, and I learned a lot. Hopefully I can share some of what I learned today. The title of my talk is Architects of Globalism. I want to talk about American planning for the post-war world that occurred basically between 1941 and 1945. I got interested in this topic when I was working on a book on how the United States got involved in World War II. I was working on America's reaction to Nazi Germany between 33 and 41, and I learned something in that book, and that is that American policymakers began making plans for the post-war period 6 months prior to Pearl Harbor. And that led to me to two conclusions. Number one, American leaders 6 months before Pearl Harbor assumed the United States would be in the war. And secondly, they assumed the United States would win the war, otherwise Hitler would be doing the planning. Who then did the planning? Well, I would argue that the primary responsibility for the planning took place in the walls of the State Department. President Roosevelt had his State Department advisors, and they did most of the planning. There was some stuff going on outside. The War Department did some military planning, and the Treasury Department did some financial planning, which led to the Bretton Woods Conference, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, etc. But the primary planning was going on inside the State Department. It was conducted under the auspices of first Secretary of State Hull, and then later, toward the end, Secretary of State Stettinius. There was, of course, Under Secretary Wells, Assistant Secretaries Burley and Atchison and Will Clayton, etc. But then, to supplement the State Department personnel, other people were brought in. For example, Isaiah Bowman, who was the president of Johns Hopkins University, came down to Washington, the State Department, a couple days a week to participate in the post-war planning sessions. He was one of the leading geographers in the world and knew where everything was that was worth anything. Other people came in. For example, Adolph Burley and Dean Atchison each had strong egos and didn't get along with each other very well. And so while Atchison was doing economic planning, head of the economic subcommittee, Burley was the head of the financial subcommittee, and they had a hard time getting along, and so they just brought in Myron Taylor, the former chairman of the board of U.S. Steel, to be kind of run herd over the two of them, and he kind of took over that for a while. Later on, Myron became the special ambassador to the Vatican, FDR, and sent him over to work out with the Pope, etc. So anyhow, these were the kind of the people that I'm dealing with. And what I want to argue is that these post-war planners in the State Department really sought to build a new world order. A new world order that would serve as the foundation for both American prosperity and world peace. Okay. Now, they really thought that they would have to do two fundamental things in order to achieve their broad objective. Number one, that they would have to establish a liberal capitalist world system. A liberal capitalist world system, as Justin suggested earlier, a Wilsonian system, based upon the principle of equal economic opportunity. In other words, all countries, large and small alike, should have equal access to raw materials, to commodity markets, so that they could enjoy prosperity within the framework of peaceful trade. Now, these post-war planners were haunted by a fear of a post-war depression. They thought that once we Well, first of all, they said we had a long time. The New Deal, they thought, was a failure. The Democrats in the Roosevelt administration thought the New Deal was a failure. They realized that between 9 and 10 million Americans were still unemployed in 1939 when the Nazi soldiers invaded Poland in that September. And that we were starting to pull out of these hard times because of military spending. That we were spending a lot of money, and that was putting people back to work. Also, a lot of unemployed people ended up in the Army and Navy. That's why we had Rosa the Riveter, etc., because instead of having a glut of surplus of labor, we had a shortage of labor. And so things were changing for the better. But they thought, once the war ends, we're going to go right back to where we were. In other words, if General Motors and Ford and other people stop producing military hardware, to start producing civilian commodities once again, when they turn the wheels of industry back to civilian production, who's going to buy the stuff? And they were afraid, deathly afraid, that we would be visited again by the twin problems of widespread overproduction and massive unemployment. How then to avoid a post-war depression? How to make American capitalism function prosperously? They thought there were two basic ways you could go. On the one hand, you could engage in centralized economic planning. You could plan it so everything produced in the United States would be consumed in the United States, so that there would be an internal balance between supply and demand. The problem with that approach, they believed, is that it would undermine the free enterprise system. That you would have Big Brother in Washington, just like Big Brother in Moscow, engaging in centralized planning, telling private entrepreneurs what to produce, how much to produce, when to produce it, how much to pay for it, etc., etc. The word that they would use would be economic regimentation. We would call it a command economy. It doesn't make any difference what you call it, that this is what they thought this was an option, and was an option they didn't want to go down. Now, other people said you wouldn't have to go quite that far. You could actually just engage in Keynesian pump priming. You could just borrow a bunch of money and have a public works program and build roads and national parks, etc., etc. The problem is that even people that were flexible thought that Keynesianism was dangerous. They thought it was like a habit-forming drug. That basically what you could do was, it's easy to hire someone to do something. But when the job is done, according to Keynes, and you're in a period of prosperity, that the business cycle's turned upwards, then of course what we're supposed to do is cut the spending. We're supposed to cut the spending. Then we're supposed to fire everybody we just hired. And of course people don't want to do that, and so you end up spending in good times as well as bad, etc., etc., and you don't have this nice even cycle that Keynes had envisioned. Also, there was another problem with Keynes, and that is President Roosevelt never bought it. FDR was never committed to full-scale counter-cyclical spending, and he argued that as soon as the war was over, we were going to have to cut drastically back on our spending. So basically, that wasn't considered really a viable option. The other option was overseas commercial expansion. That we could do what Wilson would want to do. That we could try to find foreign markets for the surplus products of our farms and factories, so we could maintain full employment and prosperity within the United States. That would not only allow the American people to enjoy prosperity, but they would be able to enjoy prosperity within the framework of a capitalist system. In other words, they didn't just want to have a prosperous country, they wanted to have a prosperous country without changing our basic way of life. They didn't want to have socialism or fascism or any kind of a command economy or economic regimentation or anything else. In other words, the Democrats advising FDR shared Herbert Hoover's basic idea of maintaining economic liberty within the United States. And so I think a lot of times we think of the Roosevelt people and the Hoover people as diametrically opposed, and I find that they shared many, many common assumptions and goals. The question then is how to do this, how to establish a liberal capitalist world system. I would argue that American policymakers believed that we would have to do three things in order to achieve this. Number one, we would have to lower the American tariff. We would have to lower the American tariff and then try to encourage other people to lower their tariffs in order to, they really wanted to do two things. They wanted both a reduction in trade barriers and also the elimination of commercial discriminations. So basically, not only did they want to lower tariff barriers, but they didn't want one country to have higher tariffs against country A than against country B. In other words, they want everybody to have not only low tariffs, but equal access across the board. They debated about how to get there. Some of them said, well, the best thing to do is just to maintain the reciprocal trade program and have bilateral trade with various countries based upon a non-conditional most favored nation principle, so all the benefits would be generalized to everybody else. Other people said, no, the best way to do this is try to get everybody together and have one big conference. And then everybody would realize that participating in this conference, that when they lowered their tariff, other people would lower tariff and they would be reciprocated. And that would be a lot easier than having all these individual treaties all around. Well, they couldn't get that through during the war. They finally got it through 2 years later in 1947 with the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, which is really the background to the WTO, the World Trade Organization right now. So basically, that was put in place and planned for during the war. The second thing they thought they would have to do is they would have to use American financial clout, that we would have to underwrite the post-war reconstruction of war-torn countries, particularly the post-war reconstruction of Europe, which was by far our major trading partner. And so we're going to have to do this, and you can do this again in a variety of ways. That the government will do part of it, and the government will do part of it by, for example, expanding the lending power of the Export-Import Bank so we can give more money to countries that need it. Excuse me. We could, make post-war reconstruction loans this way, but the government could also try to get other governments to help, and they could do this by forming a World Bank, and that was what that was all about. The World Bank, however, is crucial. The original idea, Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department, wanted the idea that the World Bank would actually loan a bunch of money. But he found out that Congress wouldn't go along with this, and so they backtracked, and what the World Bank would simply do is guarantee the payment for private New York bankers. So basically, most of the money is going to come out of the New York banking community rather than Uncle Sam. That was the idea. As you know, it didn't turn out that way. Later on, we had a Marshall Plan, and Uncle Sam put up about $17 billion. But that wasn't the plan then. They didn't think that would be necessary at all. They thought that most of the money would come from private banking sources, and some of the money would come from the American taxpayers in the form of the Export-Import Bank loans. Finally, they thought that they would have to promote the decolonization of the world. That basically you had countries, allied countries like England, France, and Holland, etc., that had colonies that they dominated and that they exploited for themselves. They put up tariff walls around them, and so they could monopolize the raw materials markets for themselves. Well, what Roosevelt wanted to do, and the State Department policymakers, they wanted to gradually, not immediately, rapidly. They didn't want to rapidly decolonize the world because they thought that would lead to chaos and bloodshed. What they wanted to do was to gradually decolonize the world. They had they developed an idea of what they called the trusteeship plan. And the idea was that under the auspices of the United Nations, that there would be a trustee or group of trustee nations that would take over colonial areas. They would call them dependent as opposed to independent territories. Take, for example, Vietnam, which would be, we would call it a colony of France. They would say it was a dependent territory within the French Empire. At any rate, the question was, what are you going to do with a country like Vietnam? Well, FDR would say, well, what we can do is we can have trustees. Maybe Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese, will be on the trustees, and maybe Stalin will be a trustee, and maybe Uncle Sam will be a trustee. So we have the three trustees, and the role of the trustee would be twofold. Number one, they would gradually introduce institutions of government so that they could actually, under tutelage, learn how to govern themselves. And in a place like Vietnam, it might be very fast. It might happen just in 15 or 20 years. In a place like Borneo, it might happen in 300 years. I didn't think that some people were ready for this at all. They weren't utopian dreamers. They understood that some places were much more prepared to govern themselves than others. But the trustees would have another obligation. Besides preparing their wards for eventual political independence, they would also make sure that the open door policy was implemented in those areas. In other words, no one would monopolize those areas, but those areas would be open. So other countries around the world would have equal access to the raw materials and commodity markets within those trusteeship territories. So that was the idea. And of course, the idea would be that if this was true, if you had equal access to all the former colonies around the world, it would be good for the United States, right? Because American companies, American farmers, American manufacturers would have access to those markets to help maintain full employment and prosperity here. But not just Americans, that other countries would too. And they were particularly concerned about what they call the have-not countries. There were two have-not countries that they thought were potential troublemakers because of their past history, Germany and Japan. By that they meant that both Germany and Japan had a narrow natural resource base, an inadequate natural resource base to support its dense urban population. In other words, both Germany and Japan had to export manufactured goods in order to earn foreign exchange needed to purchase raw materials to feed their machines and foodstuffs to feed their population. And if countries like Germany and Japan were prohibited from gaining access to raw materials and commodity markets around the world in order to support themselves, that they would be tempted to once again try to steal the stuff. In other words, the question is how are Germany and Japan going to be reintegrated into a peaceful family of nations? And the answer is that they gave was that we're going to have to show them how they can satisfy their essential economic needs through peaceful commerce rather than through military conquest. So that was basically the idea. Well, all these plans, all these economic plans, depended upon one thing. They depended upon British cooperation with the United States. Because if Britain and the United States combined controlled over half of world trade, and if Britain and the United States joined hands to try to establish a liberal capitalist world system, then other countries could easily be induced to join. But if the British went their own way and clammed up back into their imperial preference system and had a sterling bloc and tried to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, other countries might do the same and we would be stuck. There would be no liberal capitalist world system. And so one of the keys to all this is getting the British to cooperate, getting the British to go along. They thought that they had two things that they could do to get the British to go along. The first thing was they could use Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease aid program, as a lever to pry open the British Ottawa imperial preference system. What the British did in 1932 was to establish a preference system around all their colonies and commonwealths. And so there would be low tariffs within the system, but high tariffs around the system. So in other words, it would just say the relationship between Wisconsin and Canada. Wisconsin would like to send dairy products, you know, to Canada. Well, they'd have to pay more to get in than somebody else would within the empire. And the same thing around the board. So basically, the trade going between Canada and the United Kingdom, or Canada and Australia, New Zealand, or whatever, would have a low tariff, and trade going from the United States to the United Kingdom or to Canada or to New Zealand or whatever would have a higher tariff. And so the tendency would be to trade within the sterling bloc and leave the United States outside it. So basically, the proposition is quite simple, that if you would like us to give you Lend-Lease supplies, weapons to defend yourself against Germany, we would like you to open the doors to your markets after the war to us. And of course, there was a lot of back and forth about all this. The British didn't want to do this. They didn't want to sign on the dotted line. We're trying to get them committed in advance, etc., etc. And we finally got a master Lend-Lease plan after Pearl Harbor in February of '42. And even that, it was kind of a little wishy-washy, so that the British weren't totally committed to this. But we thought that we could totally commit them to it with our second thing, and that is that we knew that when the war was over, the British would have to come to the United States for a post-war Reconstruction loan. And we thought that we could force the British to abide by what we would call liberal commercial principles. Now, there was a problem then. It wasn't simply the Ottawa imperial preference system. During the war, the British had imported all kinds of goods from countries like India. And they paid for those goods not with other products. They paid for them with IOUs. They paid for them saying, after the war, we will pay you back. And the IOU was called a blocked pound. So rather than a regular pound that you can convert into gold and turn the gold into a lira to buy an Italian good, or a franc to buy a French good, or a dollar to buy an American good, or a mark to buy a German good, or whatever, these blocked pounds could only be used to buy British manufactured goods. And so basically, after the war's over, all these other countries like India that have blocked pounds will not be able to purchase from the United States or anybody else if they want to. They're going to have to use that currency to buy from England and only to England. So we said, look, we would like to give you, we're very generous. We would like to give you a long-term loan. It'll take 50 years to pay it back. And we'll only charge you 2%. The effective rate is about 1.5% because you don't have to pay it back for 5 years. You have to start paying interest for 5 years. So we're very generous. One condition and one only. You agree within a year after the British loan goes into effect that you have currency convertibility and that the pounds become unblocked and that we have access to your empire. Okay. The British didn't want to do this. The British basically said that we would rather not borrow money at all. We'd like you to give it to us instead. In other words, the British were really asking for a Marshall Plan. And we said, well, we understand that, but the American people won't go along with it. Congress won't go along with it. And the best we can do is what we're doing. But in order for you to do that, what are you going to do for us? And that is, you're going to unblock the currency. Well, what happened? There was a rush on the pound, and ultimately, the British were broke. They weren't just teasing us. And we gave them another 10 years extension. So then they really had until 1957 before they really had to go to complete convertibility, because it turned out that we were a little hard on them. At any rate, So all of this idea is to create a prosperous and peaceful world order. But they weren't dreamers. They understood that basically this might not work. I mean, even if we can have an international open door, and even if Americans are prosperous, there might be another Hitler that will come along and saying, I don't just want to trade peacefully, I want to dominate. I'd like to dominate all of Europe or something like that. And in other words, that this liberal capitalist world system will provide an opportunity for a country like Germany to choose peace. But it's possible that even if you provide them an opportunity to enjoy prosperity within a framework of peace, some nut might come along and say they want more than that. And that means that you just can't depend upon a Wilsonian world to maintain world peace. You're going to have a second thing. And that was, you're going to have to establish an international security system. We would call it the United Nations. The idea was that the big four policemen, United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China, the big four must serve as world policemen. They would divide up the responsibility militarily. England and Russia would hopefully keep the peace in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The United States, hopefully, would be able to keep the peace throughout the Western Hemisphere and also Asia. Raises a question, you know, what about China? And the answer was that, well, hopefully China will be able to help us shoulder this military burden in the future. But right now, China is too weak and disorganized, etc. And so China's going to have to get back on its feet and get built up, etc. So in the short run, it will really be the big three rather than the big four trying to police the world. There would be two divisions in the United Nations. There would be a General Assembly, which all the small countries around the world would be invited to join. And it would do nothing. As FDR said, it would give the smaller countries time, opportunity to blow off steam. It was not to be taken seriously. Ultimately, of course, it was taken seriously and became, during the Cold War, a very useful propaganda tool that you could use against first Russia, and then later on people using it against the United States, etc. But the real power was going to be in the Security Council. The major powers were going to dominate. This is not democratic at all. This is big power diplomacy. FDR didn't even want a General Assembly. You know, he said, you know, this will just be a vacuous debating society. You know, nothing will get done. It's crazy. But he was convinced to go along by Sumner Welles and other State Department people, saying you can't just insult the rest of the world. That you're going to have to make things look a little bit better. At any rate, the big three are going to dominate the Security Council. Then they decide to add France, etc. So it'd be big four and then a big five, etc. But the original idea was basically that it would be the people that won the war would police the world after the war. The idea was that there was a debate on whether or not a country involved in a dispute should be able to participate in deciding what should be done with that dispute. Well, Stalin said, no, we must have unanimity, that all decisions that the Security Council will do. The Security Council really do two decisions: to either impose economic sanctions or use military force against an aggressor nation. Okay? So whether or not you want to impose economic sanctions or military force, everyone's going to have to agree. So each country, Britain, the United States, Russia, will have a veto power. At first, Americans said, well, this is awful. Stalin just wants a veto power so he can dominate East Europe. But after a while, FDR began saying that he thought Stalin had a point. That what if, for example, the United States was in a disagreement over petroleum in Mexico. Do we want other countries sticking their nose inside the Monroe Doctrine? The argument was no. That we want to handle that ourselves. And secondly, if you didn't have a veto power, if the Security Council decided to go to war, what would that do to the American Constitution and the constitutional prerogative of the Congress to declare war, if it's already been done in advance? And so there were certain legal concerns as well as concerns about protecting the Monroe Doctrine. And so they began thinking, well, you know, maybe Stalin's not all that far off. Maybe the principle of unanimity should hold sway. Maybe there should be a veto. And that's how it was constructed. Now, these strategic plans depended upon Russian cooperation. Sorry. We're running out of time, and so what I will try to do is say that the Russians, basically, we were afraid that the Russians were going to try to take over Eastern Europe. We thought that they wanted a security perimeter. We thought that we could try to stop them by, number one, telling them that we will join the UN, we will be part of the Security Council, we won't bail out like we did in 1919, and we will help keep the Germans down. Secondly, we will loan you billions of dollars for the post-war reconstruction of the Soviet Union. And what we wanted, what we called it, was an open sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. That we thought that the Russians should treat Eastern Europe the way we would treat Honduras or Costa Rica. That the people in Honduras or Costa Rica would have the freedom to practice whatever religion they wanted, to elect whatever political leadership they wanted, to have their own democratic and cultural institutions. They would be able to trade with anybody they wanted. But they would not be allowed to let Germany or Japan or somebody else come in and establish a military base aimed at the United States. Like, for example, the Russians tried to do with the Cuban situation in '62. Okay, so basically we wanted to let the Russians have their own military physical security protected and still allow the Eastern European countries to be part of the liberal capitalist world system.